Welcome to this explainer. We are jumping right into a massive, frankly undeniable contradiction sitting right at the heart of the Philippine education system. Normally, you'd think that if a country pours more time, billions in funding, and sweeping new laws into its schools, the students are naturally going to come out better educated, right? But what happens when that basic equation just completely breaks down? Well, let's find out.
Because here is the million-dollar question driving our analysis today. Why doesn't more schooling equal more learning? It's a totally fascinating yet urgent puzzle. Even though we've opened more doors to classrooms and passed these well-intentioned, monumental reforms, actual student learning is completely stagnating. And honestly, in some places, it's actively dropping.
Part 1. The Education Paradox Explained. To really wrap our heads around this paradox, we have to look at the lofty ambitions of recent public investments. Major legislative overhauls, like the K-12 program, were specifically designed to align the Philippines with global standards. And sure, they successfully kept kids in classrooms longer. But there's this brilliant quote from a 2024 analysis by Basilio that just hits the nail on the head. Increased years of schooling have not translated into proportional gains in literacy and numeracy. Basically, the expected payoff, that absolute mastery of reading and basic math, it just hasn't materialized at all.
Think of the education system like a giant engine. We are pouring in all these massive, heavy lifting inputs, right? More years of schooling, the sweeping K-12 reform, decentralization laws. But when we check the output on the other end, the engine is just sputtering. We're getting stagnant literacy, low numeracy, and incredibly weak foundational skills. The hard truth here is that we have a massive productivity problem. Pouring more into the top of the funnel literally isn't generating better results at the bottom.
Which brings us to Section 2, Shadows of the Colonial Past.
So how on earth did a system with such good intentions end up here? Well, we have to quickly investigate our first suspects, institutional legacies. A culture of pure compliance and centralized authority was hardwired into this system centuries ago. Think about it. During the Spanish era, education was essentially a tool for religious instruction and social control. Then the American era brought standardized public schooling, sure, but it cemented a highly centralized governance structure and this heavy dependence on English. Even post-independence attempts to decentralize have just been wildly inconsistent. These aren't just dry history lessons. These eras structurally define the exact weaknesses that persist in modern classrooms today. It is kind of wild to think that a 19th century mindset is still bottlenecking a 21st century classroom.
Take the language barrier, for instance. The American introduction of English definitely helped unify national communication, but as Gonzalez noted back in 1997, it embedded persistent tensions in identity and pedagogy. So what does that actually mean? It means the very way students are taught, and the fact they're forced to process complex new ideas in a foreign language, creates this deep historical friction. It just makes daily learning fundamentally harder than it needs to be.
Let's move to Section 3, the Global ASEAN Reality Check.
We need to look at the hard evidence here. Because when we compare the Philippines to its regional neighbors, that old lack of funding excuse completely falls apart. Look at Vietnam. They actually achieve much higher learning outcomes despite spending less per student than a lot of their peers. That proves the real issue is system efficiency. Singapore focuses relentlessly on teacher quality, which leads to super strong accountability. Malaysia relies on continuous monitoring with highly structured frameworks. But in the Philippines, the defining feature is fragmented implementation, which inevitably leads to inconsistent instructional quality. The contrast is sharp and honestly undeniable.
And we see the human cost of all that fragmentation right here in the 2018 PISA data. Filipino students scored well below the OECD average, with the vast majority failing to reach even minimum proficiency in reading. Just think about what that means for a second. Most students are leaving school without the basic comprehension and problem-solving skills they need to just survive in the modern workforce. Despite high enrollment rates, the essential skills needed to build a functional society simply aren't being acquired. We're talking about a very real threat of generational economic stagnation.
Cordero's 2023 critique gives a memorable yet incredibly tragic name to that data: schooling without learning. Students are showing up, they're sitting in the chairs, they're moving through the grades. But they're doing it all completely blind, without ever actually mastering the competencies required for their level.
Section 4, Revealing the Systemic Culprits.
So if funding and access aren't the primary suspects, what is actually causing this massive disconnect? As we dug into the research, the core finding became crystal clear. It's what experts call the implementation gap. This is that critical systemic disconnect where comprehensive, genuinely well-designed policies are just poorly executed at the school level. The Philippines has gorgeous frameworks on paper, like the Basic Education Development Plan 2030.
It's a beautifully written document, but on the ground, it's incredibly weakly operationalized. The policy exists in the Capitol, but the practice doesn't match it in the classroom.
And this gap triggers a vicious cycle of 3 systemic failures. Step 1, policy misaligns with school practice. Step 2, because of that exact misalignment, teachers become completely overwhelmed. Instructional quality plummets because educators are drowning in administrative paperwork instead of, actually focusing on teaching. And finally, step 3, weak accountability. The monitoring systems we do have are obsessed with compliance, not actual student learning. The system is tracking whether the right forms were signed, completely ignoring whether the kids are actually getting smarter.
Which brings us to our final part. Section 5. Closing the execution policy gap. Mowing these culprits, the verdict is incredibly clear. We have to stop creating new policies and start enforcing disciplined execution of the ones we already have. This means fundamentally shifting our priorities. We absolutely must streamline those administrative demands so teachers can actually teach. We need to empower local school leaders to adapt these reforms on the ground. And most importantly, we have to hold leadership responsible for outcomes, meaning, did the student actually learn the skill, rather than just compliance, which only asks, did you fill out the paperwork? I want to leave you with this final vital thought. The evidence proves that incremental, on-paper changes just aren't enough anymore. So we have to ask, will the next wave of reforms finally focus on true execution, or will it just suffocate teachers with another layer of compliance? If we want to break this cycle of schooling without learning, we have to demand a system where education translates into real-world capability. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking the hard questions and keep demanding better execution.